Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Araf, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay. I think we're going to the next chapter.
Kavod Araf, I think it's Kuf Ayin Sayin, no? It's a new chapter.
See. Yeah, Kuf Ein Zain. Yes. Okay. Okay, so it says here in the Torah, אמר הפאפה, הלכתה דברים הבאים מחמת הסעודה, בתוך הסעודה אין טעונים ברכה. לא לפניהם ולא לאחריהם, כגון בשר ודגים וביצים. Right, so here we're talking about, things that you eat during the meal, your relishes and your main dish and your side dishes and all that stuff. Right, so these things do not require a blessing since they are part of the meal, so they are subsidiary to the bread. That's what he's saying. Okay. Not before and not after, he says. Kagon basar b'dagim. So he brings the examples, right? Meat, fish, eggs, right? Vegetables, gvina, the cheese, right? Daisa. What's daisa? Porridge, right? Okay, so yeah. We're not eating porridge that much these days, but whatever. Especially with meals. לא מבעיה אם מנפת בהם בפת שאינו צריך לברך עליהן, אלא אפילו אם אוכל אותם בלא פת, אין טעונים ברכה לפניהם. So he says, right, that even not only the things that you eat as them as a relish with the bread, but even things which you don't eat with the bread, per se, but they're a part of the meal, so therefore you do not bless on these things. Okay. ולא פת, אין טעונים ברכה לפניהם, דברכת הפת פוטרתן, ולא לאחריהם, דברכת המזון פוטרתן. Right, so they don't need also a blessing afterwards either, because the birkat hamazon will absolve all these things, so therefore they're covered from both sides, whether it's before or after. Okay, good. So, okay, so let's see the bit Yosef. That should be good enough. So it says about Yosef, ושלא מחמת הסעודה, בתוך הסעודה טעונים ברכה לפניהם, ואין טעונים ברכה אחריהם. So he makes a deduction, right? That we talked about things which come in the meal. So he says, what about things that come uh, are not coming because of the meal? They do require a blessing, right? But not afterwards, only just before. לאחר הסעודה טעונים ברכה, uh, בין לפניהם ואחריהם. But if you're having it after the meal, you need a blessing before and after. This is the way it's written in Brachot Mem Aleph Amud Bet. והסכימו תוספות. תוספות agrees, והראש, and the Rosh also, לפרש דברים הבאים בתוך הסעודה, מחמת הסעודה, היינו כגון בשר ודגים, right? So again, right, we're going through these things, right? Meat, fish, right? Your vegetables, right? Your porridge, right? All these things. So what does that mean? These are things that come with the meal. ולאכול בהם את הפת, and to eat together with that the bread. הילקח אפילו אכלן בלא פת, אין טעונים ברכה. So therefore it says, even if you're eating it without bread, it still doesn't require a blessing. What does that mean without bread? That means, in other words, like you're not eating bread towards the whole meal, during the whole meal. There are parts of the meal where you don't have bread with them. You just leave it there, on the table. You let kind of let go of it, right? But nevertheless, since you're inside the meal, you're still covered with the blessing of the meal. So you don't need any extra blessing there. Okay, so these are things that are basically known to people, more or less. It's like the opposite, right? Is like it's kind of funny. There are some people who are that take this to the opposite extreme. Like some people think, some people who are ignorant in halakha a little bit, they think you have to make blessing on when you eat French fries, you need a blessing on the ketchup also. It's like a little bit extreme. Which is very far fetched. I mean, you certainly don't need blessing on the ketchup or things like that, right? Which are subsidiary. They're called tafel. So some people are a little bit. They do things a little bit fun the funny way. Uh, so that's that. And let's see what else we got here. So לכן בגלל בהג, let's also say בהג, דברים הבאים מחמת הסעודה, כגון ביסרה וכברי, it's the same thing you're saying right over, so I'm not going to even translate it. It's just repetition basically, just different poskim are saying the same thing. וכל מיני בישולי דרכיו למך בהו ריפתא. So it's anything which goes with the bread, accompanies the bread basically, right? Could be anything, whatever, right? Could be falafel even, it's a modern example. Right? וכן ירקה, right? Or vegetables, salad, right? All that kind of stuff. Botzine and teonim bracha. All these kinds of things, they don't need to be blessed on, obviously. Okay. לא לפני ולא לאחרים, whether it's before or after. ודברים הבאים בתוך הסעודה שלא מלחמת הסעודה, היינו כגון תאנים. So now, right, there are things also that come, you eat it in the meal, but it's not really, a part of the meal. It's more like something, on the outside, So what does that mean on the outside? It's more like a dessert food or, some kind of a thing like that. So it's not really a part of the meal per se. So he brings, right, some examples. Tanim, anavim, right? What are we talking about? Figs and grapes, right? These are dessert foods. the chol mine pirot and all kinds of fruits like that, right? We had, when we were in Israel, me and my friend of mine, who was a big rabbi there, we had a discussion about Waldorf salad. uh, because, in Israel, they like to have this like, as an appetizer. It's like it's in, it's the in thing in Israel, It used to be anyway. I don't know, it still is, but people like that stuff. So, it's good. It's a good thing. And the question is, we had a question, do you have to bless on that, Borei Pri Etz, right? It's made out of apples, whatever it is, right? Do you have to bless on that? So, he answered me, this rabbi, his humble opinion was that it does not require, and the reason is because it's like an appetizer, it's a part of the meal, basically, even though it's a fruit, So that's not exactly what we're talking about here, because here we're talking about fruits which are like not really a part of the meal. It's not an appetizer, really. It's more like a dessert food, But Waldorf salad is not a dessert food, it's an appetizer, if you know what I mean. So, not exactly the same thing, right? Okay, so that's why, I think he was right, that rabbi. When it comes to Waldorf, we're not going to bless on that. But when it comes to just having fruits per se, so then we do because it's dessert. That's something else. Like, just give you a personal example, for me, like on these short Shabbats, now the Shabbat is very short. So, for Silah Shlishit, the third meal, I barely have room to eat. Like, I can barely stuff something down my stomach. I have to like force myself, like very much. So what I do is I eat like the bare minimum, like very bare, and I have like a little kazait of bread, challah, whatever it is. And then, I try to have a little fruit to make blessings, what bless some blessings. Because on Shabbat, you're supposed to make blessings, it's a thing. Because we're short some blessings on Shabbat. So, the 100 blessings that we do every day. So we're short. So we try to make it up. And so, that's exactly what I do. I have these kinds of fruits, and I bless on them because they're not really a part of the meal, and whatever, So I don't really eat much bread either. So, just basically dessert, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Whatever it is, it is. Okay. But the thing is, that we're going to see that in those days, right, the good old days, when these books were written, when it comes to actually like eating dessert, in other words, really dessert, like in other words, after the meal is over already. So you're having some dessert. So they differentiated that with what we just spoke about now. Because here we're talking about where you're having these fruits during the meal, but it's not really a part of the meal in the sense that it doesn't accompany the bread. Then it's going to talk about dessert, which is after the meal, which has its own rule. But the truth is, nowadays we don't have a different rule for these things. Now the rule seems to be the same, basically. No matter if you had it during the meal or after the meal, since it's a dessert food, so we treat it as such. So we're gonna go into that slowly right here. We're gonna discuss this whole thing. Okay, so לאחר הסעודה פירוש דברים שהזכרנו למעלה בין במחלת הסעודה בין המים במחלת הסעודה אם הביאו לאחר הסעודה קודם בברכת המזון כי היו רגילים בימיהם לאחר גמר הסעודה כבר משכו ידיהם מן הפת שהיו קובעים עצמם לאכול פירות ופרפרת ולשתות יין. So he says, right, this is what they did, in the old days, right, which is exactly, pretty much what we do today. Which is right that after the meal is over, they bring dessert, and that includes several things, depending on how fancy, right, the host wants to be, right? He can make it very fancy. I remember, there was this rabbi I used to go to when I was in Israel. He would invite me for Shabbat, and his wife was like an incredible cook, like One of the best things I've ever seen in my life, probably the best I've seen in my life. So, she would bring like a whole dessert table, so it was like, I don't know, 10 different things going on there. You know, so, that's exactly what we're talking about here. You're bringing like a dessert table there, and you're not eating bread anymore, right? You're done with bread. So it's not really part of the meal anymore. It's a separate thing. It's a separate entity. So there, right? What they say is that, let's see, right? What they say. I could tell you what they say, but I'd rather read it inside. So this way, we can be more accurate with it. So, right. So it says, ולאחר מזון היינו דמינן בתגומתיתין בירך על היין שלפני המזון פתר את היין שלאחר המזון וכן בירך על הפרפרת שלפני המזון פתר את הפרפרת שלאחר המזון. היינו לאחר שסילק המזון קודם את ברכת המזון כיוון שמשכו ידיהם מן הפת כל מה שהביאו לפניו בין דברים הבאים למלאכת הסעודה בין דברים שלא מלאכת הסעודה טעונים ברכה בין לפניהם ברכה להם. So right, so that's the thing, what he says over here is that in those days they had one difference than what we have today, which is that they would also bless afterwards as well on these foods. In other words, before they did the Birkat Hamazon, they would bless an after blessing, after bracha, which is something that we do not do. So the question is why, what we have to figure out is why has the custom changed? Because, the truth is that the original custom was this. That they used to bless also afterwards as well. But the truth is, if you just think about it, just simply in your head, what we do seems to make more sense. Why? Because since we're eating all these dessert foods before Birkat Hamazon, so then the Birkat Hamazon should absolve it. So why should you need to make an after blessing? There's no seems to be redundant. But nevertheless, that's what they did. So we have to see why that is. So now he explains this right over here. So let's see what that is. It says, אין פותרים אלא מה שנאכל תוך עיקר הסעודה. Okay, yeah. So he says like this, right? That Hamotzi and Birkat Hamazon, he says, only absolves, Birkat Hamazon only absolves things that were eaten during the meal. But this is considered to be already after the meal. So Birkat Hamazon doesn't absolve that. The truth is, in our logic, this doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? But for some reason, that's the way they did it before. So we have to look a little bit further into this, right? To see what what the logic is over here, what the whole point is. כתבו עוד, דין זה, האחרון, אינו מצוי בינינו בזמן הזה. Okay, now here he comes, right? So he says that in our times, this is not really something which is done. It's not the same situation in our times. So then what is the difference really? Right? What they had dessert, we have dessert. So what's the difference between our dessert and theirs? So he says, right, the difference is like this. So he says the reason is because we don't really like we don't really remove ourselves from eating bread during the dessert. Which by the way, by us we do actually, right? Like nobody today, eats dessert with bread. So, maybe in their times, it was the time of the Rosh, which was like, 600 years ago, 700 years ago. Maybe in those days, they used to eat, it's also on Tosfot, if I'm not mistaken, this whole thing. They used to eat, dessert, while still having nibbling on the bread also a little bit. So what does that really matter if you're nibbling on the bread? Because that means it's still part of the meal. It's not a separate entity. This is the whole thing. But the truth is, nowadays, we don't nibble on the bread, right, during the dessert. Nobody does that. So, we're done. That's very interesting. So anyway, right, let's move on a little bit. משוך ידינו מן הפת עד ברכת המזון, ופירוש זה נמשכו מורדכי. So he says Mordechai also writes this in the Samag. אגב מנמניות, right, רבן יונה כתב פירוש זה, פי שכתב גם כן פירוש אחר. So he says Rabbi Yonah wrote this, and also he wrote a different commentary as well on this whole thing. Different reasoning. So he wrote two things over there, whatever, two different things. Rabbeinu Satam Devarav Keperush Tosfot ve'Arosh. So he says, right, that the Tur went like Tosfot and Rosh. ואף על פי שכתבו דין האחרון אינו מצוי בינינו ורבנו כתב בו כמו שרגילים בסעודת גדולות. Okay, so the Tur went like his father, the Rosh, and Tosfot, meaning to say that they're still nibbling on the bread during dessert. And therefore we don't bless on those foods after, just before. Okay, so כתבו דין האחרון דאינו מצוי בינינו ורבנו כתב בו כמו שרגילים בסעודת גדולות. דמשמע שהוא מצוי בינינו, לא כאשר שמה שכתבו שאינו מצוי בינינו היינו בסתם סעודות דידן. שאף על פי שגמרנו הסעודה, אין אנו מושכים ידינו מן הפת עד ברכת המזון. ובסעודות הגדולות מצוי הוא וכיוון שרגילים לסלק פת מן השולחן, ודאי שטעונים ברכה לפני ברכיהם, כמה רב פאפה. Like, so look what it says. So the conclusion over here is like this, right? According to Bet Yosef here, that really, right, we should keep the old custom, which was to say the blessing before and after as well. And he says the reason is because when we have like big meals, we do not nibble on the bread, right, during dessert. It's removed from the table altogether. You know, so then, okay, well, that leaves us with one question, right? What about us? We don't eat bread with dessert. So then why aren't we making the blessing before and after? It could be, by the way, just one idea. I think I had this idea before also, when I learned this some other time. Could be the reason is because even though we don't nibble on the bread, during dessert, but it is left on the table, the bread. They don't remove it from the table altogether. So it could be that's the reason why. So in other words, it's still available there for you, if you want to indulge in some more bread. It's still there. Could be that's the reason why. Okay, let's look in the Shulchan Aruch and we'll see in the Mishnah Berurah what he says about this. Very interesting, actually, to get to the bottom of this whole thing. Okay, so let's go Shulchan Aruch. So we're going to okay, here we go. So it says in Shulchan Aruch, דברים הבאים בתוך הסעודה, אם הם דברים הבאים מחמת הסעודה, דהיינו דברים שדרך לקבוע סעודתה עליהן, לפת בהם את הפת, כגון, right? So he says, right, that as we said, that if it's something, which is coming with the meal, your main dish and your side dishes and your, right, all kinds of things, right? Appetizers and right, all kinds of things like that, relishes, blah, 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 blah. So all these things, we don't bless on them because they're part of the meal. So the bread absolves it, right, as we said. So what are the examples? As we said, right? Meat, right? Basar, dagim, betzim, eggs, fish, eggs, yirakot, right? Salads, vegetables, gvina, cheese, right? V'daisa, and the porridge. Don't forget the porridge, right? We're not having much porridge these days, but anyway, umine meluchim, right? Also meluchim. So what is meluchim? We're talking about, called pickles and pickled stuff. Uh, all that stuff that we eat during the meal. Pickles, your olives, right? All that stuff, and all the other pickled things that we have, um, vegetables and things like that. So, okay. ואפילו אוכלם בלא pot, even if you're eating them without bread, right? The bread is just like sitting there, you're not eating it. And teonim bracha lifneim, they don't need a blessing anyway. Beforehand, the kata motzi potatan. Why? Because hamotzi absolves them. Velo lachareim, right? And also, we don't bless afterwards either. Because hamazon potatan. Why? Because hamazon absolves it. Okay. ואם הם דברים בעמים שלא מלחמת הסעודה, דהיינו שאין דרך לקבוע סעודת עליהם. If there are things, as we said, right, which don't count really, as a part of the meal, right? So meaning what? That people don't eat this food with bread, it's just not like something which accompanies the bread. The pot, kagon, right? What's the example, right? As we said, right? Tanim, anavim, the figs, right? And the fruit, the grapes, the whole mine, perot, and fruits, right? All kinds of fruits, except the Waldorf, right? Forget about the Waldorf. That's not a part of it. Im ochel otam belopat. So if he eats them without bread, tonim brachat b'klavim, they do require a blessing before, right? These things. The birkat hamotzi and hamotatan. Why? Because hamotzi doesn't absolve them. Why is that? They don't mikra seudahen because they're not really part of the seudah. The enam tonim bracha achrayim, so they don't need a blessing afterwards. The cheman sheba b'toch seudah. Why? Because since they're coming in the seudah, birkat hamazon potatan. So then birkat hamazon will absolve them. ואם בתחילת אכילתו אכל פירות על הפת, בסוף אכל עמהם פת, אפילו אם בינתיים, so then he says, right, another option. That, what about if he started the meal, right, eating, fruit? So now we're talking about like the Waldorf, right? Exactly. That's the whole point, right? Things like this, which are coming as an appetizer. Or, you have it, at your weddings, right? You have your fruit salad, that comes right before. All these kinds of things, right? Very common nowadays, right? To serve these kinds of things. But then he ate with bread, right, together with them. Even if he ate them without bread. So they don't require blessing at all, right? These things, as we said. So again, right, that's exactly what we just said, right? That it really depends on what the purpose is of the food. Right, So on your fruit salad, right, then your Waldorf, you're not going to bless on that. But if you're just having, just basic fruits, and not with the bread per se, so then you will bless. Okay, great. So that's that. That's Aleph, and I think we have also Bet here. So let's see what it says here. Now we're talking about after the meal, right? But it's before Birkat Hamazon, which means what? That it's dessert, right? We're talking about dessert. Right? So that was a custom in times of the Talmud. It looks like they were doing like we do, today, right? Same thing. Having a dessert table. So but the critical thing here is this, that they were pretty much, they stopped eating bread at that point. Um, that's what really changes everything, because once you stop eating bread, you are already basically not in the meal. You're a post meal over here. That's what it really is. Okay. So if that's the case, כל מה שהם מביאים אז לפניהם בין דברים הבאים מחמת הסעודה, בין דברים הבאים שלא מחמת הסעודה, טעונים ברכה. So there, right, they do require a blessing, whether it's before or after. בין לפניהם בין אחריהם. המוציא ברכת המזון אין פוטרתן. So why is that? Because המוציא and ברכת המזון does not absolve them, and the reason is because we're not eating them with the bread. The bread has already been removed. אלא מה ש... ודין זה אחרון אינו מצוי בינינו. So he says, you know what? He says, this kind of thing is not found in our times. We don't have this custom, nowadays. לפי שאין אנו רגילים לשוק ידינו מן הפת עד ברכת המזון. So he says, why? Because we don't really, stop eating the bread until Birkat Hamazon. And so, as we said, right, nowadays, it's not like this, we actually do stop eating the bread. So then, the question still remains, why don't we bless afterwards as well? Just like it says in the earlier authorities, like in the Talmud. Why don't we do that? So now we need to look at the Mishnah Berurah, right, and see what he says about this. Very interesting. Um, there's Biur Halacha over here. So let's see the Biur Halacha, what he says. Biur Halacha. Yeah, so basically, well, he's pretty much saying what I told you before, the Mishnah Berurah. So he says, that nowadays, it's, as we said, right, we don't really eat bread during the dessert. So apparently, you would think that we should do like, the good old days, right, when they used to bless before and after. But he says, still, we do not. Why is that? So he says, because in those days, right, we already mentioned this before, if you remember, that in those days, they used to have like small tables for each person, individual tables. And what they would do is once they started the dessert, they would remove those tables, altogether, and therefore, as we said, right, the bread wasn't really there, so it's considered to be like a different stage in the meal altogether, you know. But nowadays we don't remove the table, right? We have a nice big table that stays there, right? Nobody removes anything, and also, as we said, that also. We don't even remove the bread sometimes. The bread stays there, even though we don't eat it, but we don't remove it either. So basically, this is the reason why we don't blast afterwards, according to Mishnah Berurah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can see that. So basically, right, he talks about this at length. I'm not going to read this whole thing here, but basically, right, bottom line is that we do not bless after these foods, these dessert foods, only before. That's pretty much what it is. That's our custom today. Okay, okay, great. So let's move on. Let's move on. So we'll go back to the Bet Yosef and tour, see what we can find. Yeah, so it says over here like this, the tour. כתב אדוני אבי הראש, says the Rosh, יש להסתפק במי שקובע סעודתו על הפירות, right? So now we're talking about a case where a person, right, makes a meal with fruit. אם אכל מהן תחילה מעט בלא פת, so what does that mean? Let's say he had before, right, at the outset, he just had some fruits without any bread. אם יש לברך עליהם, the question is, do you bless on them? סברה היא שלא יברך עליהם. So he says, the logic says we should not bless. Why is that, by the way? The reason is because since it's a part of the meal, so just like any other meal, you don't bless on the side dishes, whatever you want to call it, right? The relishes, whatever. So now here in this meal, the fruit is the side dish, the relish, the main dish, whatever. It's all everything. So then why should you bless? So he says, since you are having basically a fruit meal, right, you know, so then why should you bless on them? Just like any other relish. אם אוכל מהם מעט בלא פת, אבל כשמביאים אותו פירות באמצע הסעודה, ונקרא הסעודה עליהן, אף על פי שמלפת מהם פת, אם אוכל מהם תחילה מעט בלא פת, צריך לברך עליהם. But he says there's also another scenario which you would bless on them, which is you're bringing the fruits in the middle of the meal, as we said, right? But you're not really making the meal with the fruits. Just like something you're having, right, in addition to the real meal. So there, it's not really a part of the meal, and therefore we don't bless. So that we already mentioned, beforehand as well. So that's the end of the tour. That's where it ends in this chapter. So let's see the bit Yosef where he goes with this, right? It's pretty clear. His words are clear. So says Bet Yosef, זה לשונו שם, right? This is the language of the Rosh. ואדם מה שאוכל בתחילת הסעודה פת פירות יש להסתפק אם אכל מהם בלא פת אם יברך עליהם. So he says there's a doubt regarding this, right? Where if he's making a meal with fruit, and if he's having, some of the that fruit before the bread, will he bless on them? ואם לאו, סברה הוא שלא יברך. So he says the logical thing is not to bless, he says, right? As we said. Um, והבו אשתם מחמת סעודת. So he says that's really a part of the meal, even though he's having a little bit before as well. דעיקרא סעודתו סמיך עליו. Why? Because the main meal over here is the fruit. So, I mean, we don't really do this very often today, nowadays. But, somebody who's like on a diet, maybe may want to do something like this, right? Basically, have a meal just with like fruit salad. It's not very common today, but it's possible. You never know, right? So, wants to have a very light meal, whatever. A very tropical meal. Something like that. I don't know, right? So, man, baby. So, I've never done this in my life. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, so so he says we don't say here that he gets nullified with the majority of the people. So what does that mean? Since the majority of people don't make meals like this, you may think, well, he's just like an oddball. This guy, he's a black sheep. So we shouldn't really, take him into consideration. But it comes the Rosh and tells you, no, we should, because actually he's making a meal with fruit. That's what he's doing. ואילו אוכל מהם בלא פת בירושלמי, אמינא רב יונה, אכל תמרה עם pita, right? So in the Yerushalmi, he brings up Yerushalmi here, right? Brachot. So it says there that Rav Huna ate dates with bread. Oh my God. Oh, right? אמר לרב חייא ברש"י, פליג עד כל רבך שבכאן בתר מזונך, ואת מברך עליהם תחילה. בסוף אמר לאינון עיקר נגיסתי. Right? So, yeah, so these two rabbis had a discussion over here about this. So the right basically, right, one rabbi is telling the other, listen, like you should be blessing on this, this is fruit. Uh so the other rabbi answers him, no, sir, I'm sorry, but I'm not blessing. You know why? Because this is my meal here, right? I'm making the meal on this stuff. This is not like just some kind of a dessert or something, whatever, right? פירוש הם עיקר סעודתן ביחד, עניכם לבסוף. So it says, therefore I can't really, leave them, to eat them at the end. משמע דלאחר מזונה דקאמר, היינו, אחר הסעודת, קודם ברכת המזון, כמו פתר את היין, דלאחר המזון דמתניתין סובר כפסקה דרב פאפא, דכל מיני פירות לאחר הסעודה טעונין ברכה לפניהם ולאחריהם, אבל בתוך הסעודה אין טעונין ברכה לאחריהם, אפילו אכלן בלא פת, דאי בלא פת טעונין נמי ברכה לאחריהם, כשאוכל בתוך הסעודה, למה לי למשפקין הוא פטר מזונה? אמר לו, אכול אתה בלא פת, אפילו בתוך הסעודה, ויברך עליהם תחילה, וסוף ומי הוא, אין להוכיח מכאן שאם הביאו פרק. So basically, right, these rabbis had a big discussion about this whole, situation there. So the question is, what can we glean out from this, in halakha? So he learns from here, right? That what? This is the Rosh, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just make sure. Yeah, this is the Rosh. Yeah. So the Rosh says, what's the takeaway from this Gemara? So he says, "אין להוכיח מכאן," you shouldn't prove from here, try to prove from here, שהם הביאו פירות לאכול בהם פיתו, that if they brought fruit to eat with his bread, ואכל מקצתן, he ate a little bit, but לא פת without the bread, באמצע הסעודה, in the middle of the meal, שלא יהיה טעון ברכה, they shouldn't need any blessing, לפניהם, beforehand, מדלא אמר לה שיאכלם בתוך הסעודה, because he didn't tell him to eat them before, within the meal, כי לברך עליהם גם בסוף אמר שבכן פטר מזונך עד כאן לשנו. Yeah, so basically, right, the Rosh is saying that this Talmud in the Yerushalmi is basically teaching you that it really depends on how you're eating the fruit during the meal. And so just to go through, right, all these variations that we spoke about. So according to the Rosh, the way it works is like this, right? If you're having a meal, and basically you're having a meal with fruit, so then even if you're having a little bit fruit before the bread, you still will not bless on it, because your intention is to have that with the meal. So therefore, what you're going to do is not bless on that at all, unless, right, as we said, that you're having it not with the bread, right, and not, as a part of the meal. That's a different story, even though you're having it during the meal. Or the other option is also you're having it for dessert, right? And there we said you definitely do have to bless on that. Right? מה שכתב רבינו, אבל כשמביאים לו פירות באמצע הסעודה, אין עיקר סעודתו עליהן, צריך לברך עליהן. נראה דהיינו במה שכתב הראש, ומיהו אין להוכיח מכאן שאם הם יהיו פירות לאכול בהם פתו, ואף על פי שלא כתב הראש פסק דבר זה, משמע דרבנו שמאחר שכתב דהן להוכיח משם ושלא יהיה טעון ברכה לפניהם, אמר אי הוא סבר שטעונים ברכה לפניהם. Right, so, basically what he's saying here, the Beit Yosef, is that even though the Rosh didn't really say explicitly what the Tur is claiming over here in Halakha, but he says he learned it out from the logic of the Rosh, the way he deduces things over here. וגם המורחי כתב כדברי הראש, מורחי also writes like the Rosh, וזה לשונו, this is the language of the מורחי, יש להסתפק אם אדם אוכל בתחילה סעודת פת פירות, והם עיקר הסעודה, אם יש לברך עליהם, אם לאו, כי סברה הוא שונו. So he's saying exactly the same language as the Rosh, that there's going to be a little bit of a doubt if you're having the fruit before the bread, and you're having a meal with fruit, whether you bless on that or not. So he brings Yerushalmi, right, that we just said. Yerushalmi, Rav Huna achal tamre im pita, amar le inon ikar legisati ve'echad be'emtza בסעודה אוכל פירות ikar לממר כיוון דאין דרך ללפת בהם את הפת, טעונים ברכה. לפניהם, דאמר לשבקן בתת מזונך, ולא נמצא מזון משום ברכה, אבל בסוף כאמר יראה שמיים אוכל פירות בסעודה, יאכל קצת מהם תחילה בלא פת, ויברך עליהם, ואחר כך יאכלם בין בפת בין בלא פת, עד כאן. Right, so, ומשמע בדבריהם, שכוונתם לומר שעיקר הסעודה היא עם פירות, so, right, basically he seems to be saying very similar to the language of the Rosh, right, the Mordechai over here. So learns out from this the Bet Yosef, right? What does he deduce from here? That he says their intention is that Mikra Seuda hi perot. If you're having your Seuda, right, with bread, with basically fruits, that is your Seuda. Even though this is not the way of the fruit, right? It doesn't usually come, as a meal, right? Fruit. But he says, since this guy's doing it, right, he's making a meal out of fruit. So therefore it's considered to be a part of the meal and we don't bless on it. Even if he's eating without bread, you don't have to bless with it at all. Bless on it all. והביאו לו פירות באמצע הסעודה, אף על פי שהוא מלפת בהם את הפת, לא חשיבים כדברים במה מלחמת הסעודה, כיוון שעיקר קבע סעודתו על בשר ודגים, וכיוצא בהם, ילקח אם לא לאכול מאותם פירות ולא פת צריך לברך עליהם בתחילה, ואלו הפירות שאוכל פת משמע שאינו מברך עליהם כלל. So he's saying over here like this, right? That these are like very fine line nuances, right? And we already discussed it pretty much, so it's just repetition. But basically, right, the bottom line is telling you like this. Depends on how you're having the fruit. If that's like your meal, so then you will not bless, right? But if it's just coming as an extra thing, besides your other things, right? So then you will bless. כל שהוא עיקר עמו תפילה, מברך על עיקר ופותר תפילה. ואף על פי שכתב הרשב"א שיש מפרשים את הדברים, so let's see how much we got left here. Okay, I think it goes on for a while, so I guess we'll stop here, and we'll pick up with the Rashba next time. B'ezrat Hashem, there's still some things to do here, so we'll just leave it there now. And thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. B'ezrat Hashem, get your candles ready because Wednesday we're lighting Wednesday night. So B'ezrat Hashem, you make sure you got everything, all your equipment. You're all equipped to light the candles. You don't want to wait till the last minute, right? So, and we'll see you B'ezrat Hashem tomorrow. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you.
All the best.